Best laid plans, right, guys? So I know I said that we would be getting through abolition and women's rights, those reform efforts, in the last lecture, but we really will get through it this time. So here we go. We are talking still about abolition, which is the movement to free the slaves, to end slavery in America. And let's turn our attention to this event that occurs in 1839, 1840, called the capture of the Amistad. Amistad meaning friendship, was a Spanish slave vessel that had illegally captured dozens of slaves in Sierra Leone in Western Africa and was illegally taking them across the Atlantic to sell in Cuba. I say this is illegal because if you'll recall, in 1808 in the United States, the slave trade had ended, the international slave trade under Thomas Jefferson. That had been agreed to in our Constitution. Well, not only the United States, but also England, Spain, most of the Western European nations, as well as America, had ended their international slave trades by this time. So it was illegal. However, that didn't mean it didn't happen. There were lots of instances still of illegal slave trafficking across the Atlantic Ocean. So this was one of those. But on this particular voyage, when the slaves were sold off to their new masters in Cuba, these two Spaniards, and they were going to be shipped from Cuba to the Caribbean island where these guys had their plantation, the slaves revolted on that shorter trip on the Amistad. And they killed the captain of the ship. They killed the cook who had been threatening them and teasing them and saying that they would be eaten upon arrival at the plantation. And then they forced the Spaniards who had purchased them, who were still on board with them, to take them back to Africa, their homeland, back to Sierra Leone. And so the two slave masters, now, basically facing this mutiny, this revolt, they are going to start steering the ship back east towards Africa. But then in the middle of the night, they switch course and they point the ship going northward. So it begins to hug the American Atlantic coast until finally they're off the coast of Long Island near New York City getting provisions when an American warship, the Washington, will apprehend them. And so that's the background to this. And for the Americans, we quickly take control of the ship. We're going to incarcerate these slaves who have mutinied and killed the captain of the slave ship. And then the question is, what do we do with them? Because they were illegally brought over, but yet at the same time, remember, America has slaves. This was a common thing. But they're in the North, and they're being held in New Haven, Connecticut. And their case goes to trial. And the lower courts basically uphold that these men were illegally seized and that they should be free men and they should be allowed to return safely to their homeland back in Africa. Well, the U.S. Prosecutor keeps going after them, and the Spanish are going after them, and the slavers are going after them, and so this case gets appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And for the defense of these slaves who are just trying to go back home, to defend their case before the United States Supreme Court, the defense enlists the former president, the son of our second president, our sixth president, former Secretary of State, now currently longtime Congressman from Massachusetts, the venerated John Quincy Adams, to be the defense of these slaves before the Supreme Court to try to get them free. Because John Quincy Adams was a very famous congressman devoted to abolition. In fact, in 1844, through largely his efforts, he was called Old Man Eloquent for a reason, the famous gag rule was finally lifted. Remember, that was a provision in Congress that forbid any congressman from even bringing up the discussion of slavery. A gag. They weren't allowed to talk about it. And so John Quincy Adams, now he's in his 70s. I want to say he was like 73 years old when he defends the slaves who had taken over the Amistad. He very, very sharply defends their right to freedom, invoking, that document that his dad had a hand in, the Declaration of Independence, and saying, those words are just words unless we actually heed them, that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights, right? Like life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Unless we live by that credo, we're not real Americans, John Quincy Adams says. This is a former president arguing before the United States Supreme Court, talking about the very document that made our country free and independent, what made us Americans and made us different from the rest of the world. And his appeal worked. And the Supreme Court, they're going to uphold the lower court's decisions. These slaves are freed. And eventually, through the efforts fundraising by Northern abolitionists, they will be given the opportunity on a ship to go back to their homeland. And so that's also entering the national debate here. Again, it seems like Northerners are starting to take a stand against slavery, saying that it's wrong, it goes against our American values, and because of now the Second Great Awakening, this religious element, slavery is a sin, many Northerners are starting to say. So to just close out John Quincy Adams, because y'all know I like him too much, this son of the second president, sixth president of the United States, one of our great secretaries of state of all time, got us Florida, hammered out the agreement that will eventually secure us the border with Oregon and with Britain and Canada and all that. John Quincy Adams is going to have a stroke while he is still serving as this old man at 80 years old on the floor of the House of Representatives in Congress, and dies 2 days later. The venerated old man eloquent John Quincy Adams. We'll close that door. That chapter is done. Okay, so let's talk about the ACS. Oh boy. The American Colonization Society is going to be a group that is devoted to transporting as many African Americans as they can back to Africa. This is called repatriation, when you send somebody back to where they came from. Remember that word, repatriation, because we will be bringing it up again. You can bet your bottom dollar. And as far as where in Africa, there is an informal colony that is established in 1821 under the presidency of James Monroe. They're going to call it, and you can see where it is in Africa right there, they're going to call it Liberia, which of course comes from the word liberty, which means freedom. And today, the country of Liberia, right there on the West African coast, is still a country. It is independent today, of course. And actually, its capital is still the name that we gave it all that time ago, Monrovia, named after our fifth president, James Monroe. And this society about Africans being transported back to Africa, it had many popular supporters and leaders and funders and everything else. Southern presidents such as Thomas Jefferson, of course, James Monroe, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, they all were heavy supporters of this organization. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, the Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams, the great compromiser, he was a big advocate and at one time served as the president of the ACS, the American Colonization Society. So it has all these big names. Let's get into the issues surrounding this, okay? There is arguments today from historians that this society was abolitionist, and then there are other arguments that the society was pro-slavery. And I think like all good things, and bad things, it's probably some of both, right? And so the abolitionist argument is, from Quakers and others that supported this movement, is that African Americans, even if they were manumitted, even if they were freed in the United States, they really had no place. Even if they were to get up to the north, remember, society there was still incredibly racist. Equal rights did not yet exist. They were often seen as the cheapest labor and were abused and taken advantage of. So racism was extremely systemic. And so having no place in American society, this would be their best bet to secure for themselves, for African Americans, a better life for themselves and for their future generations. That's the abolitionist mindset behind the ACS. The pro-slavery argument is actually a pretty convincing one. It goes that since the American Revolution, it kind of inspired a lot of people to be anti-slavery. Like we were just talking about with JQA, arguing about how the slaves on board the Amistad deserved to be freed based on our founding principles of all men are created equal and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There were many slave owners that began to manumit or emancipate, free their slaves in the decade or two following the American Revolution. And then, of course, in the 1790s, Eli Whitney's cotton gin comes around and the value of slavery increases exponentially. But that meant that there were a lot of freed slaves starting to be around in the South and up in the North, several thousand. And the worry was from slave owners that the more their slaves saw these freed slaves mingling around with them, the more it would become difficult for the slave owners to keep their slaves in line. You know, if their slaves are constantly seeing these free slaves running about, doing whatever they want, it's going to make it harder for them to maintain rule and order. It would also make sense that these freed slaves, existing free in society where there are slaves, they would want to do everything in their power to try to assist enslaved African Americans, making slave revolts, like we talked about before, much more inevitable. So for those reasons, it made sense for these slave masters, the planter class, to want to get these freed slaves the heck out of America. And that's why they were in support of this American Colonization Society. So yes, racism played a huge role in the formation of this group. The slave owners' own, desire to keep their property played a role. Pro-slavery argument played a role. True, heartfelt abolitionist goals also played a role. And this society will be around from 1821 to about the 1840s. And actually, it'll be around even longer into the 1900s, but really that's the heyday when they were actually getting funding and sending ships over. But in total, I believe only about 4,500 slaves or freedmen were actually shipped over to Liberia from 1821 to about 1841. And the really bad thing is for African Americans, they didn't want this. Like Frederick Douglass himself, he said this was a bad idea. They said, we were born in the United States. We're not African anymore. We're African American. Our fathers and our fathers' fathers and our fathers' fathers' fathers for many generations were born here in the United States. Us going back to Africa makes no more sense than, British descendant American going back to England. We're no more African than white Americans are European. We're American. We've lost those cultural ties when we were, stripped of them, when we were stolen from our homeland and taken over in chains on ships hundreds of years ago. So that's the biggest argument against this. And then the other really terrible thing, of course, is that of the 4,500 that were sent over during this time period, only about 40% actually survive and are able to live there. There wasn't much funding for these voyages, so they're often met with meager supplies of food and necessary tools in order to carve out a life for themselves in this foreign land. They don't have friends. They don't have many allies there in Africa. They don't speak the language. They don't have family there. They've lost and severed all those ties. It's been hundreds of years. And then the main killer for most of these slaves or former slaves that are sent over was, of course, tropical diseases. That's what gets most of them. So in total, this American Colonization Society was a huge failure, but it was very prominent. It was seen as an option by many, what they thought of themselves as moderate Americans. One such famous example was like Abraham Lincoln. He was a big fan of Henry Clay, and Lincoln actually supported the American Colonization Society. As president, Lincoln was advocating for a version of this to be built in Central America. And Congress, I believe, proposed a possible American colony in Central America that would be called Lincolnia, after Lincoln. That never materialized. And I do believe that by 1863, by the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln is kind of changing his tune on that. And then, of course, April 11th, 1865, just days before his assassination, Lincoln gave a very famous address. This was right as the Civil War was ending, and the North had just won, where he basically lays out that suffrage for African Americans was a necessity, equal rights for African Americans. You can tell by the end of the war that Lincoln has his ideas on the place for African Americans in our society had completely changed. But at one point, yeah, he was an advocate for this idea of getting African Americans out of America. So that idea had a lot of traction for many in the early 1800s, and it will be around for a while. We'll see like Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican African businessman, entrepreneur, kind of having his own back to Africa movement as far in as like the 1920s during the Jazz Age. All right, guys, and now we're going to turn our focus to the last of the reform efforts I want to go over before jumping back into our actual narrative of American history moving chronologically, because I know we've kind of taken a pause here the last couple episodes to go over society and these reform movements. So don't worry, we'll get back to politics soon. But I want to talk about feminism. This is the idea that men and women should be equal to one another, the idea of women's rights, women's equality. And for this time, it was a relatively new notion. Remember, we talked about the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, and how they were pretty revolutionary for their speaking in front of mixed audiences. That's men and women together. They spoke in front of men with authority on an issue that was abolition. So many of the early women who start to try to petition the government for rights, most importantly, the right to vote, they got into their cause because they were seeking reform in other areas. Many of these women were trying to end slavery. Some were trying to end the abuses of alcohol. Some of them, like Dorothea Dix, were trying to reform the asylum system. So real quickly, an asylum is a mental institution, a place where the mentally ill can have refuge. It's a hospital for treatment. And in today's world, when we say asylum, usually it has very negative connotations around it. You think of those scary horror movies and flickering lights, inmates rather than patients being strapped with those, straight jackets. Took me a second to think about that. And that's, and being filled up with drugs and stuff to sedate them. That's an asylum, how we think of it today. But actually, asylums in the 1800s, before Dorothea Dix, didn't exist. So if you were mentally ill, there was nowhere for you to go. You had to rely either on charity or private hospitals. Those people who had mental illness who were from wealthy families usually, were able to get some care. Whoops. But for the vast majority of people who suffered from mental illnesses, they would wind up homeless and usually died well before their time. And so Dorothea Dix, the daughter of a minister, both her parents, including her father, the minister, were alcoholics. She grew up with her brothers and her grandmother. She is going to be very well traveled. She's going to see the earliest asylum reform efforts in England. She'll help out later with the asylum efforts in Scotland. At one point, she'll visit with the Pope in Rome and kind of inform him about the horrors of how mentally ill people were being abused and mistreated, how they were basically being left to just die out in the cold. And eventually her efforts and also the research that she does going around like the state of Massachusetts and New Jersey, documenting her findings about the situation for mentally ill, and then reporting those findings to legislators, that's going to have a serious impact in actually getting the first asylums built in the United States. And it'll be in many different states, over 28 state constructed mental hospitals. She also wanted to have a huge national asylum built on hundreds of acres, but President Pierce in the 1850s vetoed that legislation. Later on, during the American Civil War, Dorothea Dix will become the Army Superintendent of Nurses for the Union, and that's the North, by the way. I don't know if you guys know that. Hopefully you do. But as the Army Superintendent of Nurses, she was in charge of thousands of women, these Army nurses for the Union, that cared for not only Union soldiers that were hurt in battle, but also Confederate soldiers, the rebels. She instilled in her nurses the need to care for anybody who was hurt and wounded and needed attention. She also was very strict, famously, in the ethical code of standards that she applied to her nurses. They had to be between ages 35 and 50, so she's not looking for any young girls. She also was very wary of any ostentatious activities. They were not allowed to wear makeup. They were not allowed to do up their hair real cute. They had to wear either black or brown dresses with no jewelry. And they had to literally, quote unquote, be plain looking. She did not want her nurses, especially any young, pretty girls, being taken advantage of by male doctors or couriers or soldiers. And so she kind of became known as a very strict task force master when she was Army Chief of Staff or Army Chief Superintendent of the Nurses. And there's other famous women who often kind of eclipse her during the Civil War, such as Clara Barton, we'll talk about later. But Dorothea Dix has a pretty powerful legacy for being a woman who got things done at a time when women weren't even supposed to be talking out loud where men could hear them about important issues. She was on the forefront of the mental health care system and leading the Army Nursing Corps during the Civil War. Horace Mann will also do much to increase awareness for the mentally ill and help bring asylum reform. But another reform effort that Horace Mann was involved in is going to be with education. So if you wanted to know how the public education system developed in America, look no further. Here we go. Horace Mann from Massachusetts actually will be the congressman to fill in when John Quincy Adams, I know I said I wasn't going to mention him again, but I just have to. When John Quincy Adams dies from a stroke in 1848, Horace Mann will take his place there in Massachusetts. And working with Whig politicians, which we're going to talk about the Whigs when we get back to politics, Horace Mann is going to create the common school system, which is basically the beginning of public schools in America. That's kind of a huge deal. Prior to this, there had, of course, been sort of like town schools, community schools, as early established as like the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Puritans in Massachusetts. They had a big legacy of literacy. Remember that if you were a Puritan, male or female, it was very important for you to be literate, to be able to read, especially because you need to read the scripture, the Bible. And so that's a big legacy from the Puritans. And that's why Massachusetts is kind of on the forefront of public education. Now, the public schools or the common schools that Horace Mann set up, he based off of his research while in Prussia, which is today Germany. And it's going to eventually be called, kind of in some ways incorrectly, the factory school system, because he was the first to advocate that students go to school based on their grade level, because before students would all be lumped together in a range from like 6 years old to 12 years old, all learning at the same time. So he said no, do it progressive, 1 year to the next year to the next year, regardless of aptitude, regardless of how well the kids are doing. Have them with kids, other students of their same age, and have them matriculate upward each year progressively, working towards this thing, and have them go from period to period learning learning the same thing in one school as another school, again, common schools, and have them work off of a bell system to increase organization and productivity. In many ways, the common school system began to replace many of the things that parents did. So in that ways, it was good, and then in other ways, it was bad. Good in the sense that, some parents weren't teaching critical moral values to their children, and they would get sense of those values and purpose and organization in the school system. Bad in the sense that, well, again, parents now are kind of off the hook on those things. But that's the birth of the common school. And the other thing that Horace Mann really did was he laid out teacher schools, what will become teachers' colleges, or I think back then they were called normal schools. But he also emphasized the need for highly educated, qualified teachers to be teaching the nation's youth. And he especially believed that women were well suited to this task. We're talking about feminism or women's rights. He was the one to kind of feminize the teachers' movement and make that a viable profession for many young, intelligent women in the 1800s. So that is Horace Mann. Now, I will also mention, and I think it's important to recognize, that education evolved very differently between the North and the South. This education model of the common school evolved out of Massachusetts, and many other northern states began to use it. There was some, community schools and orphanages and other private charity schooling for some people in the South, as there had been previously in the North before the common school or public school system developed. But for the most part, the South was way behind when it came to education. Literacy was way behind in the South, like by the time of the Civil War. When we read the second book that I have assigned to you guys, the What They Fought For, I hope you take that as a key point of understanding that people in the North were far more likely to be able to read and write than people in the South. Not to say that people in the South couldn't, but just they weren't as likely because there wasn't as much public schooling. If you were a poor white Southerner, you were probably illiterate. And slaves, of course, remember, it was illegal. As Frederick Douglass pointed out in his narrative, it was illegal and a crime to teach a slave how to read or write because it was seen as a way for slaves to try to achieve freedom, a tool for their resistance if they were taught to read or write. So in some ways, the Southern aristocracy, the planter class, they purposefully are going to try to keep the poor whites and, of course, the slave class in the dark when it came to education. For the wealthy elite in the South, they would, of course, hire private tutors to teach their kids until their kids were of an age to go to a university or college, or to be shipped off to Europe, to England, to go to school over there. And so they had no need for public schooling, and they did not want to equalize things. For Horace Mann in the North, it was totally the reverse. He wanted public education to be a form of universal schooling, to give everyone of every background the opportunity to try to succeed and make it. Education is the great way to basically equalize your situation in life, to make something of yourself, even if you're born poor or lack the opportunities that others have. If you have an education, you can help achieve those things. And so that's the beginning of the public school or the common school system. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a very famous feminist. She and Lucretia Mott began as abolitionists when they went to attend a big anti-slavery convention in London, England. They were actually barred from entering the convention because they were women. And so that's when the two agreed to kind of take a look closer at not just the freeing of slaves, but also the way in which women were treated in society in America and in other places of the world. And eventually, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and 300 other people are going to attend the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848, in which you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton mainly is the main author behind this Declaration of Sentiments, which is entirely based off of the formatting of the Declaration of Independence. Only the key difference: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights. And then the list of grievances, the list of complaints that women have in society at this time. They go in depth, just like the Declaration of Independence has, over 27 counts of indictment or grievances. In the Declaration of Sentiments, women list out that they were not in charge of their own finances. This goes back to the colonial idea of coverture. Under coverture, basically a woman was the property of her husband when she married. All assets, all property, all money was controlled by him. She was not to be in control of any of that. Even if the woman worked, which there will be increasingly as we get to the Industrial Revolution, many poor immigrant women especially will be working. We've seen up in the north, even before this, in the early 1800s with the market revolution, mill girls like the Low girls, working at that spindle, that loom right there, you can see in the picture. They would be paid for their work, but they were not in charge of their paycheck. That would go to their fathers until they were married, and then to their husbands after they were married. So financially, not being control of your own, assets there, that was a big complaint. Another thing that they talked about was just the lack of opportunity that women had during this time. If you were a woman, there were very few jobs available to you. Thanks to Horace Mann, there is a new industry developing for women with education. But as far as anything else, really, the door was closed to women. So that's going to be another big point that's brought up. And of course, the most important thing that women bring up in the grievances at the Declaration of Sentiments was that they have no voice or say in this government, which means they weren't even human beings under the eyes of the US government because they had no right to vote. And so that becomes the major issue for women, because if women want to have asylum reform, education reform, temperance, abolition, if they want any of those things, they need to have a say in the government for the government to listen to them. You think male politicians are going to care what women say if women don't have a vote? No, they care about keeping their positions in politics. So women needed suffrage. By the way, remember at the Seneca Falls Convention, very famously, one of those few men that were in attendance that is going to help push through the Declaration of Sentiments was Frederick Douglass there. It's during the 1800s that we get to the idea of the woman's place. The woman's sphere is in the home. This is called the cult of domesticity. And these women, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and eventually her good friend and fellow founder of the National Association of Women's Suffrage, NAWSA, National Women's Suffrage Association. There's another one for similar name. I always get tied up between them. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, these other champions for women's rights, especially women's right to vote, they fight to make the woman's place critical. As it had been like during the Revolutionary War, the idea of Republican motherhood, that the woman was central and essential to having a well-informed, civically virtuous population, because, well, as the idea of Republican motherhood suggests, it's the mother that will educate the young children, male and female, that will grow up to become the next generation of American leaders. If the mother isn't well educated, then the children will not be, and our society will be doomed. So during like the Revolutionary period, women's education became a lot more important, a lot more critical. And you saw in the late 1700s an emphasis on women not only being able to read so they could read the Bible, but also being able to write, learning arithmetic, being able to handle the household. Southern women who were privately educated from wealthy families, as we talked about, it was important for them to know those skills, as they might have to run or do the management of the plantation. And so throughout the 1800s, the cult of domesticity builds, and the woman's place becomes the house. That's her sphere of influence, the home, the children, the meals, caring for the family. And of course, that's only for women who could afford it, okay? For poor immigrant women, German and Irish women at this time, this does not hold. For the poor rural folks, that does not hold. And for African American women, that did not hold. They had no such luxury of being only confined to the domestic sphere, the cult of domesticity. And so I want to talk briefly about Sojourner Truth. She gives a very famous speech she's kind of most famous for. I know I said famous a lot, sorry. in Ohio in the 1850s called Well, Ain't I a Woman? And she was pointing out that, she might be African American, her skin might be dark, but she's still a human being. She's still a woman. Why should she be treated any differently? She would, have all these, quotes where she basically pointed out to people the hypocrisy of their thinking that, she's just as much a human, just as much a creature of God as anybody else. It shouldn't matter what your skin color is. She had been born a slave in New York. Yeah, you heard me right. Up in the north in New York in the 1700s and 1790s. And remember that northern states like New York, they gradually emancipated slaves through the early 1800s. So in 1826, Sojourner Truth is going to walk away basically from her slave master. And in 1827, she formally gets her freedom. The state of New York had gradually emancipated all the slaves. And so she goes on tour in 1844. She actually meets Frederick Douglass and becomes an abolitionist spokeswoman, much like Frederick Douglass was. And she's going around giving speeches. And just like these other female reformers that we've talked about, she discovers the more and more she talks about the issue of an institution of slavery, the more she finds out she's not being taken seriously. She's being denied a place at the table. She's being denied a voice simply because of her gender, because women were to be seen and not heard during this time, the slavery of sex. And of course, it was doubly hard if you were a Black woman because you're facing racism as well as sexism. And so Sojourner Truth, before we move on, I just want to share a few of her famous quotes with you guys. If the first woman, she said, God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, stuck by Eve, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it, the men better let them. And another quote, then that little man is Black there. He says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did Christ come from? From God and a woman. Men had nothing to do with him. So her plain spoken rhetorical speech pattern was very evocative. It was very powerful. And Sojourner Truth was, and that was the name that she gave herself basically when she escaped to freedom. She will be a very powerful advocate, not only for abolition, but for women's rights. Amelia Bloomer, not really a fashion designer, but she was also a feminist of this time that developed the Bloomer suit, the Bloomer outfit. That's the picture there. Typical women's dresses during this time were incredibly restrictive. They had collars that were choking, the sleeves went down all the way. Nothing was basically visible except for your head and your hands, which usually you wore gloves even. It's almost like Muslim society. And the very constricting nature of these dresses, they would be exasperated by like corsets. These corsets were tied very tightly in the back to where a woman's waist was literally squeezed to be about that small during this time. Sometimes it would even break their ribs. Trying to sit down in a corset would leave permanent bruises on these women. And not to mention, they weren't able to move around. They weren't able to do much because you literally can't. You're too constricted. So they're like this all the time. So instead, to try to allow women to have more freedom of movement and thus be able to actually do more out in society instead of being like this all the time, Amelia Bloomer comes up with the Bloomer dress, which was still had the lace tie-up, but it didn't feature the corset. And you wore pantaloons, pants, underneath the skirt part. So you were still decent, but this way you could actually move around. Now, the Bloomer suit was derided. It was seen as incredibly uncool during the time. And the fight back against the Seneca Falls Convention, against women trying to get the right to vote, against the Bloomer dress, which seems incredibly harmless, was super fierce. Men did not want women to have equality. And I think that's evident when you look at the 14th and 15th Amendments that come about as a result of the Civil War in 1868 and 1871, respectively. Those amendments are the first to mention gender in our Constitution. And they mention specifically that rights would be given, like the right to vote, to men only, not to women. And that is why the abolitionist and feminist movements will kind of split apart, because even if the American electorate could stand giving the vote to Black men, it was not yet in the 1800s, for the most part, we're looking at you, Wyoming, ready to give that same right to women. All right. And with that sobering thought, I will end the lecture for today. Thank you guys very much. See, I said we'd get through abolition and feminism, the last of our reform movements. When we do our next lecture, we will be talking back with politics and picking up where we left off with Jackson and Martin Van Buren and the rise of the Whigs and going into that manifest destiny. Thank you guys. Bye.